Ted Cruz refrained from directly labeling Adam Schiff a liar. Instead, he executed a much more devastating maneuver. He retrieved statements made by Schiff's fellow party members, specifically verbatim remarks in which 250 Democrats described nationwide injunctions as hazardous and recited them directly to Schiff individually. Following this, he questioned Schiff on why his political faction currently champions the very mechanism they previously attempted to dismantle. All of this occurred within merely the initial 10 minutes. The events that unfolded subsequently are something Schiff will permanently struggle to overcome. Senator Cruz showed up ahead of schedule. His documents were already neatly arranged on his desk before the initial staff member even entered the room. He had two piles of paper, one thick and one thin, alongside a pen perfectly aligned with the border of his nameplate. The thinner pile rested on top. He avoided looking at it as he had no need to. He had meticulously constructed this hearing in the same manner a builder constructs a home. The groundwork had been laid weeks prior, and today was the day for erecting the framework. Adam Schiff entered the space with his usual demeanor for such occasions, completely unhurried. He offered a slight nod to a staff member on his left and exchanged a quick word with the senator seated next to him. He took his seat and tweaked his microphone single-handedly, displaying the casualness of a driver adjusting a rearview mirror before a very familiar commute. This was the Senate Judiciary Committee, and he held a seat on it. Regardless of anyone's opinions on his path to getting there, he had arrived. That self-assurance is crucial to note. Hold on to that image because it would dissipate before the hour concluded. The core of the hearing centered on a phenomenon occurring nationwide. A single judge in a solitary courtroom issuing a decree that completely halted the Trump administration from implementing its directives. This freeze applied not merely within that specific judge's jurisdiction, but everywhere. A solitary signature effectively restricting 330 million American citizens. This practice is known as a universal injunction. Cruz referred to it as the subsequent stage of legal warfare. This is the reality of the situation, Cruz explained to the attentive room. When the opposing political faction suffers an electoral defeat and concludes that the electorate made a mistake, they realize they could not achieve victory at the voting booths. Furthermore, they found themselves unable to secure victory through indictments. Consequently, they have resorted to judge shopping. They are seeking out sympathetic judges one by one in the most heavily Democratic districts available. Cruz presented the statistics plainly. During the Obama administration, the total number of nationwide injunctions over an 8-year span was small enough to count on two hands. Conversely, during the first 100 days of the Trump administration alone, the figure had already surpassed the total most presidencies experience in a complete 4-year term. He refrained from offering personal commentary on these figures. He simply recited them aloud. He then placed his document down and gazed across the chamber. Schiff leaned inward. His defensive response was well-rehearsed, and his delivery was flawless. He argued that the surge in injunctions was due to the current administration breaching the Constitution at an unprecedented rate. He claimed the judiciary was not the issue, but rather the administration's lawlessness. It was an effective retort that resonated well with the Democratic aides. A pair of them traded a look indicating it would make for a good media soundbite. In a different committee setting, facing a different challenger, that response might have sufficed. However, Cruz did not wave it away. He offered a single nod akin to a mechanic acknowledging the description of a car's engine trouble. Then, he posed the inquiry that shifted the atmosphere of the entire room. If the law is so definitively supportive of your position, Senator, then why aren't these lawsuits initiated in conservative-leaning districts? Why aren't they brought before judges appointed by Trump? If the Constitution is as unambiguous as you claim, any judicial official in any court should be able to hear it. Therefore, why do your legal representatives continuously bypass every Republican-leaning district in the nation merely to locate the one Democratic judge who will grant their requests? Schiff's jaw dropped, then shut, and then opened once more. The reply he provided was significantly longer than the question asked. He discussed legal jurisdiction, the concept of standing, and the intricate nature of federal lawsuits. Every syllable he uttered could be defended on a technical level, yet none of it addressed the core issue Cruz had raised. A competent lawyer understands the distinction between merely talking back and genuinely answering a question. So does an audience that has just witnessed an individual sidestep a direct inquiry by delivering a lengthy paragraph. An aide seated in the rear briefly paused their typing before resuming. Cruz refused to let the tension dissipate. He brought up a specific instance. a solitary district judge situated in a Democratic area who had enacted a nationwide mandate freezing financial resources that the legislative branch had previously approved. This applied not just locally, but universally. One courtroom, one judicial perspective, and 330 million individuals constrained by a single signature. Cruz asserted that this does not qualify as judicial review. Rather, it is dictating policy based on geographic location. It represents a framework where the final result hinges not on legal statutes, but on which specific courthouse doors you enter. And he noted everybody present was aware of this reality. Schiff retorted by emphasizing the separation of powers. He described the judicial branch as the ultimate barrier against executive overstepping. He characterized the Constitution as an adaptable protective measure. Technically speaking, his assertions were not incorrect. However, Cruz had not inquired about abstract theories. His focus was on practical application. That practical application revealed a distinct trend, and that trend was tied to specific zip codes. Everyone in attendance possessed the ability to interpret a map. According to our governmental structure, Cruz pointed out, the electorate chooses a chief executive and that executive establishes policies. If those policies violate the law, the judicial system can intervene. Yet, what is occurring currently is not standard judicial intervention. It consists of a single judge in a singular district, selected specifically for their geographic location, overturning the desires of the whole voting public. He directed his gaze at Schiff, stating that the senator knew the distinction. The real issue, Cruz proposed, was whether Schiff only cared about that distinction when the presiding judge favored his political stance. That inquiry lingered in the air as it transcended the topic of judges. It touched upon a more fundamental and enduring concept, whether regulations are applied equally to all parties or solely when it proves advantageous. Every individual tuned into the hearing grasped the weight of that question. A legal education was not required to understand it. Your ballot, your chosen leader, and your preferred policies were being nullified by one judicial official in one building that no one sharing your viewpoints ever had the chance to enter. Furthermore, the individuals orchestrating this were the very same ones who had spent the previous 3 years vociferously arguing that a single judge should never possess such sweeping authority. Schiff adjusted his documents. It was a minor movement, yet its timing spoke volumes. He countered by citing legal precedents and the structure of checks and balances. Each statement was grammatically and legally sound. Nevertheless, each statement completely missed the underlying point, because Cruz was not challenging the existence of judicial authority. He was challenging the phenomenon where one political faction only acknowledges that authority when the geographic circumstances are in their favor. Cruz posed a question. Schiff provided a response. But that response contained a noticeable flaw that was audible to the entire room. And that flaw was on the verge of expanding significantly. Cruz was not finished probing the issue. He had merely completed his preliminary remarks. He then reached for the thinner pile of papers, the one he had left untouched since before Schiff entered the room. He opened it with the deliberate pacing of someone unsealing a carefully preserved envelope. It was neither rushed nor delayed, but entirely intentional. The entire room followed the movement of his hands. Cruz announced his intention to read something aloud, stressing that he wanted absolute clarity regarding the source of the words. What ensued was not a debate, but rather a surgical deconstruction of his opponent's stance. Cruz started reciting quotations. These were not his own words, nor were they statements from Republicans. They were exclusively Democratic quotes originating from Democratic senators, Democratic legal filings, and Democratic press briefings. They were their own statements, bearing their own signatures, distributed via their own press releases, and they all centered on one identical theme: the peril of allowing a single judge to dictate policy for the entire nation. The first statement, it came from Chuck Schumer in April 2023. A solitary federal judge located in Texas had attempted to remove mifepristone from the national market via a single decree. Schumer labeled this an extreme action taken by one judge attempting to subvert the desires of the American populace. The second statement, this was from Dick Durbin during the identical week. He described the decree as a severe ruling by a lone federal judge aiming to deprive millions of women of access to a medication approved by the FDA. Cruz delivered these quotes with the tone of someone reading an itemized receipt to a patron who had feigned ignorance about ordering the items. The audience in the gallery rustled. An individual in the second row leaned closer. The room was starting to comprehend the trajectory of this confrontation, but Cruz was not done. He possessed the legal brief, more than 250 Democratic legislators had submitted an official legal document cautioning the Supreme Court about what they termed the dangerous ramifications of permitting a single district judge to establish nationwide policy via an individual injunction. 250 lawmakers. They characterized it as a menace to the constitutional framework. They pleaded with the court to halt the practice. Cruz lifted his eyes from the document. He addressed Senator Schiff directly while the room fell completely silent. He noted that when a conservative-leaning judge in Texas utilized this exact type of injunction to impede an FDA-sanctioned medication, Schiff's faction denounced it as judicial oppression. Conversely, when a progressive-leaning judge in Rhode Island employs the identical mechanism to hinder the President of the United States from carrying out the law, Schiff's faction praises it as the rule of law. He placed the paper down and asked, "Which perspective is the accurate one?" Schiff inhaled deeply. His response focused on contextual nuances, differentiating between legitimate and illegitimate executive actions, and highlighting the judiciary's responsibility to monitor the executive branch. Every word he spoke would have seemed perfectly appropriate if read within an academic law journal. Yet every word sounded like pure evasion to anyone who had just witnessed him being exposed for expressing the exact opposite sentiment 3 years prior. Cruz allowed him to continue speaking. That was the most agonizing aspect. He refrained from interrupting or steering the conversation back. He merely sat back, permitting Adam Schiff to occupy the quiet space with explanations that the audience could directly contrast with the undeniable quotes resting on the desk. A journalist in the viewing area scribbled a note and heavily underlined it. A Democratic aide seated 2 chairs away from Schiff glanced down at her mobile device. Everyone present was putting the pieces together. Schiff reached out for his glass of water. On this occasion, he took a long, drawn-out sip. It was the specific type of sip utilized to purchase a couple of seconds of silence. Cruz then lifted a final piece of paper. He announced there was one more, citing April 2024 on the floor of the Senate by Democrats. He read the excerpt. It discussed conservative zealots manipulating the legal system, unelected judicial officials damaging democratic processes, and a single individual in a judicial robe overriding the choices of 330 million Americans. Cruz placed the paper back onto the stack. It formed a tidy pile representing a comprehensive history. He stated that those were Schiff's own words, the words of his party, and the words of his peers signed, submitted, and formally recorded. He reiterated for absolute clarity, 250 Democratic politicians warned the Supreme Court that nationwide injunctions were a threat, yet presently they are fully supporting those very same nationwide injunctions. It was the exact same mechanism, utilizing the exact same authority, just under a different commander-in-chief. He paused momentarily. It wasn't a pause for theatrical effect, but rather a craftsman's pause, the kind taken after hammering the final nail to ensure the structure is perfectly aligned. He concluded that the sole variable that had shifted was the identity of the judges executing the orders. That statement resonated throughout the chamber, and no one attempted to counter it. The metaphorical bill had arrived, and the signature endorsing it was unmistakably theirs. However, a crucial transition occurred here. Up until this juncture, the discussion revolved around legislation, judicial figures, legal injunctions, and the inner workings of the federal court system. The ensuing segment was no longer about policy. It was squarely focused on Adam Schiff personally. A noticeable shift took place not within the environment, but within Cruz himself. He reclined in his seat. He put down the document he had been citing and positioned both hands flat against the surface of the desk, resembling a person bracing themselves before hoisting a massive weight. For the forthcoming remarks, he required no written prompts. He addressed Senator Schiff, and his vocal tone had altered. It was deeper now, carrying an undercurrent of something that had been kept in reserve. He expressed his desire to pivot to a different topic, specifically to inquire about the record. Every individual in that space understood exactly what the record signified concerning Adam Schiff. They had observed it accumulate over the span of 7 years, and they had been anticipating the moment someone would vocalize it publicly, illuminated by the bright lights and captured by the recording cameras. Cruz commenced at the very beginning. He stated that Schiff had informed the American public on nationwide broadcasts on numerous occasions that he possessed proof of collusion between Donald Trump's campaign and the nation of Russia. Cruz quoted Schiff directly, noting that Schiff had claimed the evidence was in plain sight. Cruz's delivery was steady and devoid of emotion. It was the tone of an individual relaying factual coordinates rather than subjective viewpoints. He reminded Schiff that he made those declarations while serving as the head of the House Intelligence Committee. He made them while wielding the credibility of classified intelligence briefings that no other citizen could independently authenticate. Schiff adjusted his posture in his seat. It wasn't merely a slight lean or a minor tweak. It was a complete physical repositioning. Cruz pressed on, noting that Robert Mueller conducted an investigation spanning 22 months. This involved hundreds of legal summonses and hundreds of interviewed individuals. The resulting report failed to prove that individuals affiliated with the Trump campaign conspired or collaborated with the Russian state. Cruz emphasized that these were not his own conclusions, but the official conclusions of the special counsel. The audience remained motionless. Cruz then brought up special counsel Durham. He detailed a thorough 3-year inquiry into the genesis of the Russian investigation. The final verdict was that the FBI possessed no corroborated intelligence at the time it initiated its probe. Cruz pointed out that the Steele dossier, the very file that Schiff's committee had read into the official congressional logs as if it were factual proof, was actually an aggregation of uncorroborated allegations financed by the opposing political rival. Cruz allowed that profound statement to linger. He forced the room to absorb its weight. He then demanded to know where the evidence was, reminding the senator that he had assured the American populace he held it. Schiff had insisted it was clearly visible. He had repeated this claim not just once or twice, but continuously across various camera lenses and to countless audiences. Cruz asked again where it was. He wasn't inquiring because he lacked the knowledge. Every single person in the room was aware of the truth. Every individual watching from their residences knew the truth as well. Cruz's objective was to force Adam Schiff to articulate it while being recorded, with his extensive history laid bare on the desk separating them. Schiff leaned closer to his microphone. His vocal delivery was significantly more aggressive this time. He pivoted to discussing Trump's behavior. He referenced the Mueller report's documentation regarding obstruction of justice. He spoke about a wider, overarching pattern of misconduct. His words flowed rapidly. They were well-practiced phrases, identical to the ones he had deployed on CNN, on MSNBC, and on every television program willing to host him. These amounted to hundreds of television spots just within the initial 2 years of the presidency. However, within this specific room, illuminated by these specific lights, with the definitive conclusions of Mueller and Durham physically present before the individual posing the inquiries, those well-rehearsed phrases carried a different resonance. They resembled navigational instructions leading to a destination that had been demolished. It is vital to remember that every single viewer watching from home was already cognizant of this fact. They had possessed this knowledge for years. They had been discussing it during meals, in their living spaces, and within online comment forums since 2019. The crucial distinction was that finally in this official setting, Ted Cruz was vocalizing it into a microphone, and Adam Schiff was seated a mere 6 feet away, completely trapped. But the issue of the evidence wasn't even the most damning element. Cruz pointed out that Schiff had also authored a memorandum and his hand shifted to a new document. Schiff's eyes followed the movement. Cruz recounted that in February of 2018, Schiff's committee had published a memo defending the applications for FISA warrants. Cruz took a moment to clarify the implications of this. The federal government had utilized a clandestine judicial body to secure authorization to monitor Carter Page, a citizen of the United States. Cruz noted that Schiff's peer, Devin Nunes, had sounded the alarm, declaring that the warrant applications were riddled with inaccuracies. Schiff's memorandum served as the counter-argument. This memo assured the American public that the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice had not misused the legal procedures, that they had not withheld crucial data, and that the regulatory framework functioned properly. Cruz placed the document down. Everyone present anticipated his next point. Anyone who had tracked this narrative over the preceding 7 years knew exactly what was impending. Inspector General Horowitz had scrutinized those exact same warrant applications. He uncovered 17 major errors and omissions. These were not 17 trivial administrative mistakes. They were substantial flaws that hid crucial data the judicial body was required to review. The chief judge of the FISA court even declared openly that the FBI had deceived the tribunal. Cruz allowed the number to hang in the air, 17. Within a judicial framework where a single mistake can obliterate an individual's civil liberties, the FBI had perpetrated 17 of them. Meanwhile, Adam Schiff had assured the nation that the operation was untainted. Schiff's hand migrated toward the base of his microphone, gripping it tightly. Cruz hammered the point home. You assured the United States that the procedure was immaculate, Senator, but it was far from it. Furthermore, you possessed access to the exact same classified intelligence that your peer utilized to sound the alarm. While he exposed it, you concealed it. Following this, Cruz advanced to the specific incident the entire audience had been anticipating. It was the event that had lingered in the collective consciousness for 7 years like an unreachable thorn. Cruz paused his speaking. He shut the folder resting before him and moved it aside. When he resumed speaking, he did not glance at his prepared materials. He did not look toward the audience. He stared directly at Adam Schiff, mirroring the intense gaze one uses across a dining table when finally expressing a thought suppressed for the entire night. September 26, 2019. Cruz reduced his speaking pace. This was not done for theatrical effect, but to ensure absolute precision. On that specific day, Cruz recounted, Schiff was presiding as the leader of the House Intelligence Committee. The interim director of national intelligence was providing testimony to the committee regarding the whistleblower complaint related to Ukraine. The executive branch had already published its transcript of the president's phone conversation with President Zelensky. The general public possessed the text. The media possessed the text. Schiff's committee possessed the text. Cruz grasped a lone piece of paper. He refrained from reading it right away. He kept it pressed against the desk and stared across the chamber at his opponent. For a brief duration, absolutely no one in the room shifted. The aides remained still, the audience remained still, and the camera operators remained still. Every person in that space comprehended exactly what was printed on that single page. It represented 7 years of allegations, 7 years of media appearances, and 7 years of supposedly visible proof. It all culminated in the contents of this solitary document. Cruz stated that Schiff had gazed directly into the broadcasting lens. He noted that Schiff appeared to be reciting from the formal transcript, and he uttered the following words. Cruz read the quote at a measured pace. I require a favor from you, and I am only going to state this 7 times, so you had better pay close attention. I want you to fabricate damaging information regarding my electoral challenger. Ensure it is a massive amount, covering various topics. Cruz set the page down. The noise of the paper meeting the wood was the solitary sound echoing in the room. Every single listener recognized that phrasing. They had witnessed Schiff broadcast them on live television back in 2019. Now, they were witnessing those words being recited back to him by an adversary who had no intention of letting him escape their implications. Cruz pointed out that those specific phrases were completely absent from the phone call's transcript. Those phrases were non-existent in any official federal record. Schiff had fabricated them. Schiff had spoken them into the official legislative record, utilizing the emblem of the House Intelligence Committee and the power of his leadership position, presenting them to the citizens of America as if they were the genuine words of the President of the United States. The room collectively held its breath. And when you were exposed, Cruz remarked, and the fact that his volume remained steady is what made the statement so impactful you labeled it a parody. Schiff's vocal pitch elevated significantly. He commenced his rebuttal. He discussed the core essence of the phone conversation. He argued that the underlying meaning was correct, even if the specific phrasing had been theatricalized. His hands lifted from the desk, gesturing wildly in the air. His physical movements were far more expansive than his argument necessitated. His vocal volume was much louder than the amplification equipment required. He was fundamentally failing to answer the inquiry. He was merely occupying the silence with noise because noise was his only remaining defense, given that the only other option was silence, and silence equated to an admission of guilt. Cruz refrained from interrupting. He observed Schiff in the same manner one observes a driver attempting to extract a vehicle from a parking space they have inextricably wedged themselves into, violently rotating the steering wheel, only to reduce their maneuvering space with each successive effort. The wooden mallet struck the block a single time, calling for order. The sharp crack severed Schiff's statement mid-sentence, and the portion that survived the interruption offered him no assistance. A videographer stationed in the rear modified his camera shot. He was no longer filming 2 politicians. The focus was solely on one visage, the face of an individual whose logical defense had depleted its space before his voice had depleted its vocabulary. The observers in the gallery recognized they were witnessing a moment destined for endless replays, not due to its dramatic flair, but due to its absolute finality. Cruz stared at Schiff. He allowed the atmosphere to stabilize. He permitted the quietness to permeate for 3 full seconds, which, within the context of a congressional hearing, feels like an eternity. Cruz stated that the citizens of America did not vote him into office to author works of fiction, Senator. They did not grant him a top-tier security clearance so he could invent statements and falsely credit them to the chief executive, and, Cruz added, the public remembers. That declaration settled heavily upon the room and remained there. Subsequently, Adam Schiff attempted to recover his footing. He made one final effort. He moved closer to the microphone, adopting the same posture he had utilized for years. He spoke regarding the peril facing the democratic system. He discussed dictatorial inclinations. He emphasized the necessity of keeping authority in check. His vocabulary was impeccable. His sentence structure was flawless. Yet all of it entered the chamber like brand new furniture being dropped off at a residence that had already burnt to the ground. No person nodded in agreement. No aide jotted down his statements. No fellow lawmaker leaned closer to listen. Cruz remained silent. He did not issue a concluding strike. He merely transitioned to the subsequent topic on the schedule. There was no necessity for him to declare victory. The audience in the room had already reached its verdict. Schiff remained seated, wearing the identical suit behind the identical nameplate. His hands rested atop the documents situated before him. 60 minutes prior, those documents served as his weaponry. Now they were nothing more than useless sheets of paper. Not too far in the past, this very individual stood before the House Intelligence Committee functioning as its leader. He had stared into the broadcasting lenses, exuding the specific type of arrogance derived from the certainty that no one present will dare to oppose you. He had claimed to possess proof. He had recited sentences that were completely absent from any official file and credited them to the commander-in-chief. He had authored a document protecting a procedure that 17 subsequent investigators declared corrupt. He had executed all of these actions illuminated by the spotlights, wielding the power of the most critical intelligence panel within the legislative branch. And remarkably, none of these actions had resulted in any negative consequences for him. He did not lose his position, his profession, or his subsequent advancement. The very apparatus designed to enforce accountability had instead provided him with a rapturous reception on the floor of the House and a clear path to the Senate. That individual was currently sitting within this chamber. He possessed the identical hands, the identical stance, and the identical calculated blinking pattern, but the essence that had previously rendered them intimidating had completely vanished. The proceedings advanced. The wooden mallet struck precisely when scheduled. The bureaucratic engine of the Senate churned onward, resolute and completely apathetic to the profound events that had just transpired within its walls. The seat he occupied was still retaining his body heat when he departed. Nobody observed his exit. You were already aware. You were aware even prior to the release of the Durham investigation. You were aware before the Inspector General made his conclusions public. You were aware prior to the legislative reprimand, the formal censure, and the subsequent political commercials. You were fully aware when Adam Schiff positioned himself at that rostrum, stared directly into the broadcasting lens, and declared he had evidence in plain sight. And you had glanced across your dining table or across your living space, and you had declared, he is lying. You made that declaration, yet no one on that television screen could hear your voice. You made that declaration, and the broadcasting network failed to issue a correction. You made that declaration, and the print media refused to publish it. You made that declaration, and the establishment simply continued operating, continued scheduling his appearances, continued elevating his status, and continued supplying him with broadcasting equipment and leadership roles as if you had remained completely silent. You were not incorrect. You were not peddlers of paranoid theories. You were not lacking accurate information. You were not consuming an excessive amount of the incorrect news station. You were witnessing a political figure deceive the nation, and you recognized it for what it was. The singular factor separating your perspective from the recognized historical record was simply the passage of time. And here lies the reason why no individual within that establishment could risk listening to you. This is the aspect that stings far more intensely than any solitary committee meeting. He benefited from a media ecosystem that welcomed him onto their broadcast hundreds of times. And on not a single occasion did they pose the inquiry that any novice student of journalism would instinctively ask. You claim to possess proof. Are you able to display it to us? Not once. He would state it was clearly visible, and they would respond with gratitude, addressing him by his title. They would then transition to advertisements, only to schedule him for another appearance the following week. It was an endless cycle of unquestioned assertions broadcasting into millions of homes, where the audience placed their faith in the figure on the television, because the broadcasting company placed their faith in him, or at least feigned to do so, which yields the exact same outcome. And when the Durham investigation was finally published, when the Inspector General detailed the 17 massive flaws, when every solitary inquiry verified what you had suspected all along, those exact same media networks refused to invite him back to justify his previous statements. They simply moved forward. They scheduled the next interviewee. They reported on the next breaking event. The promised correction never arrived, because delivering a correction was never their objective. He belonged to a political faction that was fully aware of the truth but remained silent. Nancy Pelosi appointed him as the primary director for the initial impeachment proceedings. This was not in spite of his history but specifically due to it. The readiness to utter whatever was deemed necessary, irrespective of its factual accuracy, was not considered a weakness within that political group. It was viewed as a prerequisite. Furthermore, when the House of Representatives formally voted to reprimand Adam Schiff in June of 2023, the members of the Democratic Party encircled him on the legislative floor. They embraced him. They applauded. They yelled shame at the conservative members who had supported the measure. They transformed a formal punishment into a promotional advertisement and a monetary solicitation email, and it was entirely successful. He triumphed in the senatorial election for California. He strolled into the upper chamber of Congress. He took his seat on the Judiciary Committee. Contemplate that reality. The pathway from established deception to career elevation remained completely uninterrupted. The very structure that was intended to enforce responsibility granted him a promotion instead. Adam Schiff did not commit errors. He executed calculated risks. Allow that fact to resonate. Every single television appearance was a deliberate decision. Every single statement was a gamble betting that the American populace would never gain access to the restricted intelligence. And by the moment the reality finally surfaced, the destruction would already be finalized, and the subsequent cycle of news would simply erase the memory of it. For a span of 7 years, that gamble yielded immense profits. Every deception found its mark. Every inquiry fulfilled its intended goal. Every televised appearance strengthened his public profile, and no individual within the establishment possessed the credibility or the fortitude to challenge his gamble until that specific committee meeting occurred. The actions Ted Cruz took within that chamber were not intricate. They were not valiant in the manner that cinema portrays heroism. He did not rescue the nation within a single afternoon. His actions were more subtle than that, yet in various ways significantly more difficult. He sat directly across from an individual who had dedicated 7 years to constructing a stronghold built entirely upon baseless assertions, and he posed the necessary inquiries. He did not do this in secret. He did not do it during a televised news interview where Schiff possessed the ability to simply terminate the connection. He did it vocally, illuminated by the bright lights, with the recording equipment active and the audio devices transmitting, while Adam Schiff sat a mere 6 feet away, lacking any television director to switch to an advertisement break, and lacking any news presenter to alter the topic of conversation. He articulated the reality that the audience was already aware of. He merely articulated it in a setting where Schiff was forced to listen. You were not delusional, you were simply ahead of the curve. The facade is currently deteriorating. It deteriorates further each instance someone vocalizes the truth. And the subsequent time Adam Schiff moves closer to that audio equipment and attempts to inform the nation about his supposed knowledge, the nation will recall the afternoon Ted Cruz demanded he substantiate his claims, and he was completely unable to comply. That is a reality he cannot simply label a parody to escape. If you have spent the last 7 years anticipating the moment someone would finally state this publicly, forward this message to another individual who has also been waiting.